The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development released its status report on the global economy for 2025. It projects that economic growth remained resilient as inflation, tariffs, and geopolitical tensions have sharply impacted markets.
The OECD economic outlook that we're presenting to you projects a relatively mild negative impact of recent trade shocks and elevated uncertainty on the global economy over the next 2 years, though fragilities are significant and growth will remain low by historical standards. In order to lift economic growth and durably strengthen incomes and living standards, countries will need to respond quite decisively and in a cooperative way, tackling underlying risks, maintaining fiscal sustainability and advancing structural reforms.
We will take a look at how U.S. tariffs have disrupted international trade and how countries have adapted to financial volatility. But first to China, which remains focused on building its economy through manufacturing, technology, and green development. To discuss this and more, Liang joins me now from New York. She is Chair Professor of Economics at Willamette University. Liang, great to see you. Now, the OECD is projecting that China's economy will grow 5% this year. What is behind Chinese growth, despite the fact that, as I've just mentioned, we see all these economic headwinds, particularly the United States tariffs?
Yeah, good to be with you, Anand. So I think their assessment is based on, first of all, the first 3 quarters, China's real GDP growth was at 5.2%. And so the year-round target is 5%. And so according to the OECD, China is well on target, right, to reach that 5% growth goal. And they ascribe the success, I think, to one is there's very strong fiscal support this year. The fiscal deficit to GDP ratio was raised by 1 percentage point to 4%. And so that provides robust fiscal support to the economy. Then I think they also talked about how China's export performance has been very resilient this year, despite the U.S.'s unilateral trade war. And I think they're also mentioning, China's consumption demand and its industrial upgrading are all, proceeding in a very, I would say, robust, right, and resilient way. So I think all of this made them sort of confidently assess that this year's growth rate is going to achieve 5%. That said, they also talked about the challenges, right, the Chinese economy faces going forward in 2026 and 2027. So I think, the idea is that consumption needs to be continue to be boosted, and infrastructure investment needs to be also advanced. And manufacturing investment could face some headwind because of the anti-involution campaign. But overall, I think the assessment has been balanced and quite positive for China's economic outlook.
Yeah, I want to talk about Chinese consumer spending in more detail in a moment. But if we look at the changing global economic scenario, I mean, in the face of these tariffs that have been imposed largely by the United States, we're seeing a realignment of trade relations. We're seeing new alliances being formed as well. At the moment, the French President Emmanuel Macron is on a state visit to China, and one of the things that he talked about with Chinese President Xi Jinping is an expansion, a deepening of trade relations between the two countries. In fact, Macron also had a bit of a warning. He said, at the moment, we are facing the risk of the disintegration of the international order that brought peace to the world for decades. How important is this visit by Macron? What does it tell us when France and China talk about expanding relations?
Yeah, absolutely. I think this visit is very important, as you just mentioned, that the global trading system has quite remarkably shifted, right, because of the U.S.'s unilateral trade war against, many countries in the world. And so I think countries are navigating and trying to build, I would say, new and alternative trading system. And I think that China and Europe relationships is very important in this sort of new trading, investment, et cetera, multilateral system. And I think Macron's visit is very positive. And as he mentioned, and both leaders talked about how both China and Europe would like to uphold the kind of multilateral system and resolve disputes through dialogues and negotiations. And so I think that is important, right, to really chart the course forward. And specifically with China and France, I think both leaders talked about they want to continue to cooperate in some of the traditional sectors that the two countries have already deep cooperative relationships, right? Like aerospace, aviation, and nuclear energy. But both sides would also like to explore new channels and expand the areas of cooperation, and that include digital economy, green economy, pharmaceuticals, and artificial intelligence, and so on. So I think this is really in the interest of both sides, really to explore new ways of cooperation. And again, like I said, these trying to resolve difficulties and differences through open dialogues and negotiations rather than any sort of unilateral actions.
Okay, let's get to consumer spending. China is looking to boost consumer spending through a $141 billion plan, just over $141 billion. Now, consumption contributed about 53% in the first 3 quarters of this year compared to 44.5%. That was for the whole of 2024. So put this into perspective for us. How important is consumer spending for the Chinese economy?
Right. I think there is a misperception that somehow China's demand is collapsing, which again, if we look at really the data, as you just mentioned, consumption actually contributed to more than half, right, 55% of China's GDP growth this year. And again, the retail sales number, the first 10 months, China's growth in the retail sales of goods is 4.3%, and the retail sales of service growth is 5.3%. So it's clear that demand is growing. But of course, because China's industrial upgrade and technological breakthroughs, the supply side has expanded very rapidly. And so that's why I think there's still room for China to increase demand, especially consumption demand. Now, and I think, both in the 15th five-year plan and the recent 18 points stimulus of consumption that is issued by the State Council, really indicate that the Chinese government is aware of the potential to grow consumption demand, and they've been putting out policies, like you mentioned, $180 billion for consumption stimulus. And I think going forward, this 18 points identifies some of the specific target areas that the government wants to boost consumption, and that include a lot of services, right? Elderly care, health care, tourism, and cultural experiences, and so on and so forth. So I think on the one hand, we need to understand that the China's consumption demand is actually growing in a steady manner. And on the other hand, we also see that there are room for continuous growth. And I think that really shows the government's determination, right, to use these policies to stimulate demand. And I think that is good for China's own, lifting the living standards, but also it's good for, China's import demand, as China now really trying to, open up at a high level, at a high level, right? For example, by providing zero tariff for 53 African countries in June this year. So I think, there's a lot of potential for China to improve its consumption demand.
Now, China's also taken the lead in developing its digital economy. In fact, it will bring in $11.28 trillion this year. There's also the Internet of Things that's come to be known. How will all of this, the development of this digital economy, fit into overall Chinese economic planning for the future?
Right. I think digital economy is really very significant for China, right, from both the supply side, because when you have the Internet of Things, you're able to digitalize commerce, production, and so on and so forth. This could really help to boost productivity growth and also improve the quality of the supply side. And the demand side, I think, is also very significant. When you look at the retail sales, the overall growth, as I mentioned earlier, this year has been 4.3%, but online shopping has gone up way more than that, more than double the average growth in retail sales. So I think that's also, that means it's very important that as China continues to build the digital economy, e-commerce, this will also help to boost demand significantly. So that's why I think digital economy has been a focal area for economic development in the past few years and decade, and also going forward as well.
And one other point, Liang, very briefly. So the 15th five-year plan has been discussed. It's going to be implemented. It jumpstarts in 2026 and will last until 2030. Where does the economy fit into this plan? What are the priorities in it?
Right. So this 5-year plan is very essential, right, for China to achieve the goal of a moderately prosperous economy by 2035. So in this plan, I think two things are really important. One is to continue to boost technological innovations and to upgrade traditional industries using these all-purpose technologies. And so that would help to really drive the economy forward through productivity growth. And the second point I think is important in this 5-year plan is, again, to invest in the people. What that means is, you're going to provide more consumption support and also a lot of services that would help to, boost the social safety net and also enhance people's living standards. So I think both sides are important, right, to provide the supply side, innovations and productivity growth, and also the demand side to continue to propel the demand growth.
Liang, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Let's now turn our focus to the United States, which has been impacted by US President Donald Trump's tariffs policy. I'm joined now by John Tamny. He is president of the Parkview Institute and editor at RealClearMarkets. John, great to see you. The OECD is projecting that the US economy will grow by 2% this year, 1.7% in 2026 and 1.9% in 2027. Looking at these numbers, these projections, what does it tell you about the US economy?
I don't think it tells very much. Never forget, an economy is a collection of individuals. GDP, on the other hand, is a number arrived at by economists sitting in an office far from the action. GDP rises if government spending goes up, even though that's naturally a barrier to economic growth. Conversely, GDP declines the more that imports come into the United States, even though imports are the surest sign of a growing economy, that Americans are producing more such that they rate more imports. You can grow your economy by propping up businesses that the markets would rather see die. And so I don't focus too much on that. What I focus on, Americans are generally productive when they're free to produce, they do.
There is also this other, I guess, more nebulous factor which we hear about very often, and that is when economists and analysts talk about confidence. And looking at these numbers, what does that do for confidence?
I don't think it does very much, simply because the people who drive the U.S. economy aren't focused on GDP. Let's use an example. NVIDIA, the most valuable company in the world right now. For decades, it was just a few weeks or months from bankruptcy. Do you think that Jensen Huang was focused on GDP numbers? He was just trying to keep his company alive. America is driven by the entrepreneur, by individuals who see something wrong with how business is being done and how they're going to change it, and they'll do it against all odds. This GDP is for economists. It's not for people in the real world actually producing wealth and actual economic growth.
If we look at the Trump tariff policy, of course, it's impacted countries around the world, but here in the United States, Americans have felt the cost of inflation. We have groceries, fast food, basic shopping prices going up, home prices, car prices have gone up as well. What is the overall impact of these tariffs domestically?
Well, by definition, it slows economic growth. And it does for a variety of reasons, but the biggest reason is that when we're dividing up work with the rest of the world, we're working most productively. It cannot be said enough that the United States is a much richer economy, a much richer country with potential for much greater growth, precisely because China is increasingly a rich country. Instead of the U.S. working in autarkic fashion, it's dividing up work with China, with England, with Japan, with Spain, go around the world. And this means that Americans can specialize, and when they can specialize, they can do the work that most elevates their unique skills and intelligence. Tariffs quite literally force what's brilliant in reverse. And so we just have to hope the courts will save Donald Trump from an egregious error. Everything about production is about bringing people closer together. Tariffs try to push us apart, and they slow our prosperity. We need to get rid of the tariffs.
Well, let's look at some economic activity in the United States. There's been quite phenomenal growth and investment in AI technology. It accounts for as much as half of US GDP growth in the first half of 2025. Nearly half of the 12,000 data centers that are, of course, key to the operation of AI technology are in the United States. Where do you see this going?
It's going in places that I don't think any of us could possibly know. And that's what's so exciting about it. It's got to be remembered that when John Malone started laying cable in the 1970s to build the U.S. cable industry, he didn't know at the time that he was putting together the infrastructure for the internet revolution. And so we see this proliferation of data centers. And so people view them as centers that allow Americans to have better search results on Google and ChatGPT. But we haven't scratched the surface of what these data centers mean. They're going to transform all aspects of work. They're going to free Americans in the world from all aspects of work on the way to even more specialization. And I'll add, there's going to be lots of carnage along the way. Some of these data centers will fail. Some of these AI companies that are blue chips right now will fail, but it will all be progress, enormous amounts of investment in the creation of an all-new future that no one was even thinking about a couple of years ago. What a world to live in, what a world to be young in, precisely because it's going to be transformed into something so much better.
And look at areas of potential growth. I mean, we look at climate change and what that means, where the investment might go there in terms of green energy. President Trump, of course, is very skeptical of climate change. In fact, he's called it a hoax. But now we have a report from the IMF which says clean energy investments generate about 1.5 times their cost in economic activity compared to fossil fuels. 43 million clean energy jobs are expected to be created by 2050. I mean, can the United States continue to ignore these realities on climate change and, of course, the enormous economic opportunities that it offers?
Well, it doesn't matter if the U.S. ignores it or not. I mean, let's never forget, for one, in the 1970s, they were saying that global cooling was going to be the challenge. And so it's really hard to predict the future. But let's assume that the U.S. turns its nose up to clean energy. The beauty of it is it doesn't matter. Because if the rest of the world sees what the U.S. doesn't see, we can import the genius of its foresightedness, just as we import all sorts of other things that elevate us. And that's what's exciting to me about the data centers. They're big, they're massive energy consumers. What does that tell you? It tells you, I think, that we're on the doorstep of the discovery of all sorts of new ways of creating, of extracting, of driving energy creation. Some of this could be clean energy, some of it could be more fossil fuels. The truth is we don't know, because remember, 3 years ago, no one knew that the data centers were going to be such a part of our economic future. All we know now is that the need for energy in the future is going to be exponentially greater than it is now. And that's an exciting thing too, because it's going to drive enormous discoveries on the way to, my guess, if history's any guide, much cheaper energy for future generations.
And just one final point, John, and that is looking at the year ahead, what do you see as the main risks to the U.S. economy?
I would say the biggest risk to the U.S. economy is also a risk to the global economy, and it's President Trump's oversight of the dollar. Let's never forget the dollar is the world's currency. It is the currency that the world uses for the most part to move goods around. We see this a lot in China. President Trump mistakenly believes that a weak dollar is the path to prosperity. There is no evidence supporting that claim. All evidence points to quite the opposite of it, because when you're cheapening your currency, you're harming every single earner of dollars, but you're also driving down the very investment that drives progress. And so if any time I talk to people inside the Trump administration, I'm always clear, you must get to Scott Bessent and Donald Trump that no U.S. president has ever succeeded while devaluing the currency. They've got to reverse this. This threatens us. It threatens the world.
John, thanks for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
China and the United States are the world's two largest economies. How have trade tensions between them affected nations globally? Our next guest, Otaviano Canuto, is a senior fellow at the Policy Center for the New South and the former vice president of the World Bank. Otaviano, good to see you.
Good to see you, Nan.
The OECD projects that global GDP will slow from 3.2% in 2025 to 2.9% next year, 2026. To what do you attribute that slowdown?
The slowdown has to do with the uncertainty generated by the U.S. trade policies, as well as the fact that we have an economy, the U.S. economy, moving on a two-track path, in the sense that you have a booming dynamics on the side of AI and AI-related investments in data centers and so on, pulling up the economic growth of the U.S., while at the same time the rest of the economy is facing some difficulties generated by the tariffs themselves. The overall message by the OECD is that the economic growth has remained resilient. We see that China will manage to reach its target growth of 5%, and whereas in the U.S., we have this two-track road. On the one hand, the economic growth remaining higher because of the AI-related investments, but while at the same time the job creation has been so slow. But the overall message is that the projection of growth is one of a little weakening in the next year. The OECD is projecting a global GDP growth of 3.2% this year, which is a bit higher than the one projected by UNCTAD, for instance, to a downward movement to 2.9% next year. The OECD is a bit more optimistic in with respect to 27 and so on. But the fact of the matter is that the global growth has remained resilient despite the policies implemented by Mr. Trump.
Now, the United Nations also released its report on trade and development that you mentioned a moment ago. It forecasts that developing countries will grow by an average of 4.3%, which is a lot faster than the growth rates for advanced economies. What does that mean?
Well, of course, that reflects the resilience of growth in China, of course, but also the fact that the AI-related investments in the U.S. have, imported a lot of things from Asian countries, for instance, and in that regard, the resilience of global trade has surprised many, despite the headwinds on the side of the U.S. The fact of the matter is that the resilience of global trade has surprised many. Of course, in the first half of the year, we had the front loading of trade, but even in the second half, we have seen a resilience of trade. And in this regard, particularly Asian countries have benefited from that resilience.
We have Davos World Economic Forum meetings that'll be coming up in January. Now, the World Economic Forum says, and I'm quoting them directly here, they say we need a new measure of prosperity. Instead of GDP, perhaps we should be looking at GQ, growth quotient, the extent to which our growth uplifts people, not profits. It's something that's been discussed for a very long time, and whether GDP really tells us about our status. I mean, is it time for countries to focus on human development rather than just looking at GDP figures every year?
Yeah, it's applicable. Not only the rate of growth of GDP, but also the way by which it is being distributed. That's why some time ago, the World Bank has framed its objectives in raising shared prosperity. It matters dramatically not only the growth rate of GDP, but also the extent to which it's being widely distributed among the population. And also, of course, as the concept of human development has stated quite clearly, that besides the GDP, one has to look at other dimensions of social development. I think it is appropriate to move on from the strict measurement of progress by GDP. Among other reasons, because the income distribution dimension of growth in recent decades has not been, let's say, as favorable as the focusing on GDP statistics might imply. Look at the duality of conditions that we are watching here in the U.S., while at the same time one has the dynamics as expressed in financial markets and so on. On the other hand, the issue of affordability of living costs for the bulk of the population has not gone so well. So we have to have a more diversified and a more appropriate yardstick that goes beyond GDP. I think this is a right thing to do.
Otaviano Canuto, thanks for joining us.
A pleasure, as always, Anna.
And we need to leave it there. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C.